what to do. Okay, hi everyone. Good of you to be here, and thank you so much, Simi and Jamia, for inviting me. So when Simi invited me and I wasn't able to come at the first instance, I told her that I'll come to Jamia another time, and then she immediately suggested 4 or 5 dates. So I picked on one of those, really because Jamia has a very special place in my heart. I didn't study here. I wish I had, but I studied at almost the next best, or the parallel best university, which is Delhi University, not JNU. So, and it's great to be here. So I am I might read, I might talk, a combination of the two things. And I have given my talk a title. It's called Muktabai's Legacy. How many of you have heard of Muktabai? Anyone in this room? Okay. So Muktabai was the name of a young Dalit girl in mid-19th century India in Maharashtra. At the age of 14, she wrote an essay, and it's the only thing she ever wrote in her life, or the only thing that we know she wrote, because we don't have anything else of hers. And this essay is a document that you should read. It's easily available on the net in multiple translations from Marathi. But basically, her essay was called Come inside. So it's called On the Grief of the Monks and Mahars. It's the caste she belonged to. And it was a diatribe or a searing, angry piece addressed to the Brahmins and their monopoly of knowledge. And she basically said to them, who do you think you are to have monopolized knowledge in this way? Do we, those who live on the margins of society, do we not have the right to access knowledge, to learn from it? And if you expect us to live by the Vedas, which is what you're saying, then why are we denied access to the Vedas? Because we need to know what's in there in order to live according to it. Muktabai wrote this essay because basically she wanted to study. And she wasn't able to study because education for women and education, especially for Dalits, was not on the cards in upper caste Maharashtra, which was ruled by the Peshwas at that time. But she did manage to study in a school set up by three people whose name I'm sure you've heard, Savitribai Phule, Jyotiba Phule, and a woman called Fatima Sheikh, who made it possible for them, for the Phule couple, to actually open a school because she gave them a space. And it was in that school that Muktabai wrote this essay, and she won a prize for it. So for me, Muktabai is one of the people who talks about the activity that I am engaged in, which is the publishing of writing by women. And although she may never have written anything after that, but she is an icon that all of us should look to and look at. And please do go and look her up on the net. Now a lot of people have started creating images of her. We of course don't know quite how she looked, but you'll find lots of images on the net which say that they are Muktabai's images. At the same time as Muktabai studied in this school, or not quite at the same time, but within the same century, there was another woman who I see as an inspiration, and there are many others. I'll mention only these two, who is a woman called Tarabai Shinde. You've heard her name. Tarabai Shinde, also like Muktabai, wrote only one thing in her life, and that was this little booklet called Stri Purush Tulana in Marathi, which means a comparison between women and men. And at that time, in the middle or late 19th century, it was a searing critique of patriarchy. So just think of the kind of courage it must have taken for Muktabai, for example, to speak truth to power in the way that she did. So many of you, I think, are familiar with this. It's the writer's job to speak truth to power. And this is perhaps why we hear nothing from Muktabai after this. It could be that she was silenced by those in power. In the school where she studied, there was this other woman, Tarabai Shinde, and of course from her also, we don't hear anything after that first piece of writing. But it was these two women and several others like them whose works I began to discover completely by chance that made me think that the act of writing, especially when it comes from those on the margins, can often be subversive. It can and does speak truth to power, and it's also very, very precious. For me as a woman, a feminist, a writer and a publisher, the short essay that Muktabai wrote and the booklet that Tarabai wrote are part of the history of women's writing and the many silences around it. They push us to ask the question, how many women's voices have been similarly silenced? Is this why the world of writing has been almost entirely male-dominated? The same sorts of questions can be asked about caste and about other forms of marginalization, for example, religious marginalization. How much of the writing that exists today is by and large by upper caste, upper class, majoritarian religion men? So in my talk today, I'll be speaking as a woman, a writer and a publisher, not necessarily in that order. I believe that the act of writing and of creating knowledge and of taking knowledge to the world are deeply connected, and one can't exist without the other. So I want to try and describe this to you by tracing my own journey in these worlds. I was 21 years old when I started my first job in publishing. I was also by then deeply involved in the women's movement in India. We were out on the streets fighting against dowry, fighting against rape, creating street plays, taking them from place to place, creating songs, etc. Until then, I had mostly been, like many of us are, a reader and sometimes a writer, and I had no idea about what went into the making of a book. I got offered, by chance, a job in publishing because I had finished my MA in Delhi University in literature, the subject many of you are studying. I loved it. It opened my world to so many things, but I also hated it because at that time, all we could study was Spencer, Milton, Chaucer, and I lived in Jangpura and I went through Bhogal every day and I kept thinking, what do they have to do with Bhogal and Jangpura? What do they have to do with my reality, you know? So I just wanted a change, and I decided at a time when teaching was the only profession open to girls who had studied literature, and my teachers expected me to teach, and my mother had been a teacher, so she expected me to teach. But I decided, no, this is not for me. I'm not going to teach. I'll do anything but teaching. and I ended up teaching anyway later, but that's a different story. So, but then a world opened up to me, completely by chance. I got offered some freelance work in a publishing house. And it was a very inglorious job. It was something called being a paster upper. And basically, literally, that's what it was. I was pasting things. So what was happening was I got a job in the Oxford University Press. This is not in my talk, but I just decided to tell you the story because it's a funny story. So I got a job in the Oxford University Press, where at that time the colonial hangover was still there, and what they were doing was adapting British textbooks to Indian schools. Till that time, Indian authorship had not yet developed, Indian textbook authorship, so in the interim period, they were allowed to adapt British textbooks. And what it meant was that adaptation meant that John and Mary in the British textbook had to be changed to Ram and Sita. And so my job was to sit with Ram and Sita on a piece of paper and cut out Ram's name and paste it over John, and cut out Sita's name and paste it over Mary. So I was pasting, so I used to have these sheets of paper which said Ram, 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 Ram. So that time the imagination was very limited, और कोई नाम सूझे नहीं लोगों को, राम सीता डाल दिया. आज के दिन में भी वही डालते actually, but for different reasons. So that's what I was doing. And there was an artist employed, very interesting man called Dean Gasper, who was one of the first out gay people at that time. So you imagine this was 1972, 73. So very, very early. And Dean was employed to color blonde hair black and blue eyes black and to cut off the tops of double-decker buses. Because in India, the only city that had double-decker buses was Bombay. So what he used to do was he used to take a piece of paper and paste it over the top deck of the bus, white paper, and then we used to have that typewriting liquid which made corrections on typewriters. You know, these days of course you work with computers, but we used to type और कोई चीज़ गलत हो जाती थी तो उसके ऊपर white liquid डाल के उसके ऊपर दोबारा से type करते थे. So we used to use that white liquid to sort of the things that were left out of the cut piece of paper, उनको white liquid से वो paint करके उनके ऊपर फिर बसें ठीक से बनाते थे. So that was my job. That was a moment when I fell deeply and irrevocably in love with publishing. And I decided the smell of printing ink used to make me high, really. I was pasting these things, and the paster upper's job, I had to use a glue called rubber solution, which is the glue that is used for bicycle tires. So I became very familiar with bicycle shops in Delhi. I used to go and buy this rubber solution all the time. लेकिन वो होता क्या था कि at that time, glue sniffing was a big thing. I know youngsters used to sniff glue to get high, and all those bicycle shop wallas thought this lady is they didn't know it was going towards Ram and Sita. So anyway, that was it, and I fell deeply in love, as I said, and I decided that this is where I'm going to stay all my life. So publishing opened up a whole world for me. But my activist involvement in the women's movement brought many questions about publishing. The world of books, which I was seeing around me, was an incomplete one. It was filled with male writers. As activists, my comrades and I were confronted with many questions about the problems that we were addressing. For example, about dowry, about the histories of our laws. How were they taking the shape they were taking? Where did they come from? Was dowry only a Hindu phenomenon? All of these questions faced us. And we thought we would find answers to these in books, because at that time we didn't have Google Auntie, so it was only books that we had. But there were hardly any books about women or by women. The world of writing and publishing was male-dominated, upper caste, upper class, and men published books by men of their own class and largely for men of their own class. Women did not come into the reckoning, either of those who could create knowledge or indeed of those who could consume it or work to take it into the world. Not only was this a control of knowledge, it was also control over what was defined as knowledge. You know, what is knowledge? So, for example, women's concerns were not considered serious enough to be counted as something that could add to and inflect the world of knowledge. Men had the privilege to create what they call knowledge, to define what it was, and to hold it in their control. You know, I often call myself an alpha feminist. And I am a bit of an alpha feminist, except that often people tell me you don't look like one. And I don't know what an alpha feminist looks like, but now that I'm an old lady, it's okay. I can look like anything. But when I make these statements about knowledge was male-dominated, etc., I don't want to be hitting men on the head. And I don't want to be sounding like somebody who is saying you guys don't count at all. But it is a very, very serious reality that we were confronted with at that time. And let me give you an example. You know, you take a really well-known sociologist for, like, say, M.N. Srinivas or somebody else. What did they do in the days when they were writing? They would go to a village, they would spend months, years, whatever period of time there to do the ethnography that they wanted to do, but they only ever talked to men. Now, they only ever talked to men not because they hated women or wanted to leave them out, but also perhaps because they did not see the women, because women were inside the domestic space, or they did not know how to get to the women and speak to them, or they had never been trained to talk to women. So the work that they produced, how could it be called a complete work if it only ever was partial? That's what I mean. And if you know, I always give this example, although it has nothing to do with publishing, but it has to do with activism, of the census of India, which is the biggest enumerative exercise that happens in the world, right? And up until 1991, in the census of India, the question that was asked about work was almost always asked to the man. So the census enumerator would go into a home and he would meet the man and he or she would say to the man, "What do you do?" And the man would say, "I'm a farmer," or "I work in a factory," or "I do this, that, and the other." And then they would say, "Aapki beevi kya karti hai?" And he would say, "Meri beevi kuch nahi karti hai." End of story. So then feminists fought for 10 years before 1991, they said you cannot ask this question because your question leaves out women. Right? The way you ask it, who you ask it to, the way you frame it, it leaves women out. Next time, train men to ask the question of women. Next time, when you go into a house, go at a time when the woman might have time to talk to you. Ask her to come and talk to you if she can do that. Then don't ask her, आप क्या करते हो, क्या काम करते हो, because she too will say मैं कुछ नहीं करती, because she also undervalues her work. Instead, ask her, describe your day from morning to night. फिर वो बोलेगी मैं 4 बजे उठती हूँ, फिर मैं लीपा पोती करती हूँ, फिर मैं सबके लिए चाय बनाती हूँ, नाश्ता बनाती हूँ, सबको बुलाती हूँ, उठाती हूँ, जगाती हूँ, उनको खिलाती हूँ, उसके बाद वो नहाने जाते हैं, फिर मैं बच्चों को स्कूल लेके जाती हूँ, फिर मैं वापस आके खाना बनाती हूँ, फिर मैं फील्ड में जाके अपने मर्द के साथ काम करती हूँ, एट्सेट्रा एट्सेट्रा एट्सेट्रा. रात के 10 बजे उसका काम ख़त्म होता है. आफ्टर दैट she tries to go to sleep, but she has to provide sexual services to the man. So how can you say मेरी बीवी कुछ नहीं करती है? So from that moment on, the questions in the census start to change and you start to see a different kind of statistic. So this is a serious issue of the incompleteness or the biases and prejudices in knowledge. So that's what we were addressing. So in 1984, we decided to set up a feminist publishing house. That was Kali for Women. Our motivation to start something like Kali was to create and produce knowledge by and about women and to put women's concerns center stage. And to take this knowledge into the world so as to change forever the way knowledge was perceived and understood. It was, as I've said in the title of the talk earlier before I called it Muktabai's Legacy, an attempt to change the narrative. We wanted to signal the presence of women to provide a gendered perspective on our realities, but we also wanted to make sure that it was women who spoke on behalf of women. And we did not want to repeat the pattern of having men speak about us. We said at that time that we wanted to produce knowledge about ourselves rather than have someone else do it. And that we wanted to reverse the flow of information. So hota kya tha, because of the way knowledge travels in the world, if we wanted to learn something about dowry, for example, and there were no books in India by Indians or by women, you could sometimes find the foreign scholars' detailed work on it, which was a work done by somebody from the outside on our realities, which we had to buy at very expensive prices. And the question we asked ourselves was, क्या हमारे में ये काबिलियत नहीं है कि हम ये काम कर सकते हैं? That should we not be doing our own work? And so that was the motivation that was there behind Kali. The other motivation I've already mentioned to you, that when we started to look for material to understand the problems we were addressing in the women's movement, we couldn't find anything at all. So we thought, okay, let's do it ourselves. And I actually went to my bosses and I said to them, and they were all really nice guys, you know, liberal Bengali, ek kayast from UP, ek Angrez admi, but all men, but really decent men. And I said to them, okay, हम लोग औरतों के बारे में किताबें क्यों नहीं छापते हैं? You know, why don't we publish some books? And they said, women, do they read? Do they write? Are they serious? Is it worth publishing, etc.? And so I thought, okay, it's not going to work with these guys. I have to do it myself. There was another very interesting development that had happened at that time, which today has given us a lot more than it could at the start, but it's very significant. That is the entry of women's studies into the world of academia. It's around the mid-70s that you start to see women's studies come on the horizon, and that movement internationally is led by India. People like Veena Mazumdar and others were the ones who led it, and the women's studies, one of the signal contributions it made was to say that the arena of research could not be limited only to the public space, that the researcher had to cross the threshold of the home, had to enter the home, because inside the domestic space, inside the private space, which was linked to the public space, there was a lot going on that researchers had to take into account. And then once you entered the public space, once you entered the domestic space, you did not any longer see data, but you saw stories, you saw emotions, you saw feelings, you saw relationships, and all of that had to become part of research, which is what radically changed the subjects of research. So women's studies, which is often denigrated, actually made a very, very important contribution. So for those of us who were thinking of feminist publishing, that too was a very enabling thing that was there that could push us in the direction of publishing. However, the question we had not asked ourselves was, how do you set up a publishing house without any money? Yeah, what do you do? Generally, when people want to set up a publishing house, they go out and look for money, they look for an investor. But they're not feminists, no? They don't want their ideology to be taken over by one capitalist investor, like we didn't want that. So we didn't want an investor, but we had no money of our own. So kya karen, kaise karen? You know, how do you do this? But anyway, we did some jugaad, which was to, take on consultancies and so on and so forth. And my colleague, so the way Kali started was, it was my obsession and my idea and my passion. And then Ritu Menon, who became my partner in Kali, heard about it because she was working in publishing at that time. And she wrote to me, I was in England at that time. And she said, would you like to, are you looking for somebody to join up with you? And then we both decided to join up. So that was how we did it. And Ritu's husband then, who was an architect, gave us a free office in their garage. So humko daftar free mein mil gaya. Then we didn't pay ourselves anything. And then that was a time when India was having these festivals of India across the world. So we offered to print and publish their books. And with each book, we earned enough money to publish one book of our own. And that is how we started. So a little bit of jugaad, as they say, aurtein hamesha ye karti hain. So we started to do that. So in the early days, when we were publishing, it was important for us to establish that women had always been writing, but that their voices had by and large been ignored. We wanted to showcase the plurality and variety of women's writings, and our focus was quite strongly on numbers. कि औरतों के लेख छापेंगे और खूब सारे छापेंगे so that we can counter the dominance of men's writing. We saw ourselves as resisting, questioning, subverting, countering male-dominated knowledge. We saw ourselves as working against the grain of mainstream knowledge creation, and therefore also saw the enterprise we were engaged in as alternative. And of course, it was all of these things. But just working on these things was not enough. And this was a very important lesson we learned quite early on in our experience. Slowly, we began to collect books to publish. In the first year, we did 2, then 4, and by the time we got to about 8, we began to reflect on our practice. Thus far, we had focused on numbers. We realized that while numbers are important, they are not sufficient, for we need to look beyond numbers. We needed to see who these numbers were made up of. Where those women lived, what class they belonged to, what language they were writing in. And we realized quite soon that what we were doing was publishing women like ourselves. Upper class, upper caste, English speaking, Western educated, urban. And we were congratulating ourselves that we are publishing women and we are going against the grain. But in some ways, we were repeating the pattern of the dominance of knowledge by upper caste men by putting it in the hands of upper caste women. And that certainly wasn't enough. And when that realization struck us, we thought something's wrong with our practice. And we have to find a way of changing this. And then the change happened completely by chance. So just as writers respond to the world, so must also publishers do. And in order to remain relevant, publishing has to evolve. So we wanted to evolve. As many publishers will tell you, sometimes the life of a publisher, something happens that upturns many things and things that you've taken for granted. So this happened to us. So one winter afternoon, we were sitting in our office. The sun was shining outside. The air was not polluted because it was in the 80s. And in walked a group of women, and there were 8 women there. 4 of them were city activists from the health movement who we knew well, and the other 4 were village women from Rajasthan who were dressed in the village thing of the lehenga, choli and the odhni. And they came up to us and they brought us a book which they had made. I've told this story so many times before that some of you may have heard it, so forgive me for repeating it. But it is my favorite story and it is my all-time favorite book that we have done, although publisher should not say that. So if you put it here, I'll say I'll deny it. But it is my all-time favorite book. So they brought us a book in Hindi, which they had made by hand, and it was called Sharir Ki Jankari. And it was a book about women's bodies. So they had been, these women, you may have heard the name of a woman called Bhavri Devi. You've heard that, no? Bhavri was part of a program called the Women's Development Program, which was a very big Sarkari development program created by the central government and the Rajasthan government and a number of women's NGOs together, which took a different approach to this thing called development. Basically, the approach it took was that development doesn't mean कि आप किसी के घर में एक गाय लाके उनको दे दो, हाय, और आप उनको या सोया मशीन दे दो या कुछ और दे दो, सोइंग मशीन दे दो, और फिर बोलो कि अच्छा अच्छा आप कपड़े बनाओ और पैसे कमाओ और आप डेवलप हो जाओगे. Because basically when you go back to that question of a woman's work day, which the census is asking, उस दिन में फुर्सत कहाँ होती है 2 घंटे कपड़े बनाने के लिए या कुछ करने के लिए. So are you developing or are you adding to the woman's work burden? So in this development program, what they did was they took a different approach, and they basically said women have to form circles where they can talk to each other and talk about their problems, and then women at the village level will work in the community they belong to implement government programs in that community. So it was a very different model of development. Now in that program, these women from Rajasthan had run a series of workshops on health, and they had created this book by hand called Sharir Ki Jankari. Us kitab mein what they had done, and everybody understands Hindi, Hindustani, you know, so what they had done was that they had, kyunki wo sharir ke bare mein kitab thi, therefore you have to show the naked body, right? So आदमी की भी body और औरत की भी body उन्होंने दिखाई थी. So when they tested it in the village, everybody said ये क्या मजाक है, आप औरत को कभी नंगा देखते हैं, गाँव में नहीं देखते, तो आप इसको realistic कैसे कह सकते हो? So then these women went back to the drawing board and started thinking about it, and they came up with this completely ingenious solution, and which was that they made the woman fully dressed, लहंगा चोली ओढ़नी, और फिर उसके लहंगे को एक फ्लैप लगाया था, वो फ्लैप को आप उठाते हैं, then you can see how she is made from inside. फिर उसकी छाती पे 2 दरवाजे लगाए, दरवाजे खोलोगे then you will see how she is made from inside. और सिर्फ औरत के लिए नहीं किया था, मिस्टर मैन के लिए भी किया था. So मिस्टर मैन in the village, what does he wear in a Rajasthani village? He wears a धोती. छाती तो उनकी बेर होती है क्योंकि आदमियों को तो प्रिविलेज होता है ना, अपनी छाती तान के नंगी छाती के साथ चल सकते हैं, हम औरतों को तो वो नहीं होता है. So but men have that privilege. So छाती खाली थी उसकी और एक साफा पहना हुआ था. And then you lift up his dhoti and you see how he's made from inside, and then you see all the little fellows that come out of his body, and they have tied them up with ribbons to show male and female. It was the most brilliant thing ever that they had done. It was really a wonderful, modest but explicit way of bringing this reality of sexuality, sex lives, pregnancy, childbirth, etc. to the village. So they said आप ये किताब छापिए हमारे लिए, and we were so excited because we said हाँ हम छापेंगे, क्योंकि ये गाँव की औरतों की बनाई हुई किताब है, ये हिंदी में किताब है, it crosses all the boundaries we want to cross. They said हमारी 2 शर्तें हैं इसमें आपको ये किताब छापने में, and what were those 2 शर्ट्स? One was कि आप कभी भी इस किताब की कोई भी कॉपी गाँव की औरत को प्रॉफिट पे नहीं बेचेंगे, कॉस्ट पे बेच सकते हैं. आपको अगर 2 रुपये लगे किताब छापने में, आप इसको 10 रुपये में नहीं बेचेंगे, मार्केट में बेच सकते हो जिस कीमत पे बेचना है, बट नॉट टू अ विलेज वूमन. विलेज वूमन विल बाय इट ओनली फॉर द प्राइस इट कॉस्ट यू. एंड सेकेंड, which was a more challenging one, was that 75 of them had created the book, and they said we want all 75 names on the cover. 75 authors. So you imagine what kind of problem this poses. There was a group that worked on a book. Before we came in here, we were sitting in Simi's room and talking about Routledge, one of the big publishers. So there were some friends of mine who created a book by 9 village women, which Routledge was asked to publish, and those 9 women wanted their names, and they said नहीं हम नहीं कर सकते, ऑथर तो एक ही होता है या 2 होते हैं, यू नो. सो हमको तो ये औरतें कह रही थी 75 औरत के ऑथर्स हैं, हम 75 के नाम डालो पीछे. बट एनी वे वी डिड इट. व्हाट वी डिड वाज वी टर्न द बुक अराउंड एंड वी पुट ऑल 75 नेम्स ऑन द कवर, पीछे का कवर, और सामने के कवर पे सिर्फ किताब का टाइटल रखा. नाउ दैट बुक वेंट एवरीवेयर. विलेज वुमेन, बिफोर वी हैड फिनिश प्रिंटिंग 2000 कॉपीज़, हमारी इनिशियल प्रिंटिंग 2000 कॉपी की थी, उन्होंने सारी गाँव में बेच दी थी. You know, they had got pre-orders, like Amazon के pre-orders आते हैं, so राजस्थान के गाँव के pre-orders थे. So we sold it, and then it was translated into many languages. It was also pirated in many languages, including by the Rajasthan government and so on and so forth. But the women were very happy कि हमारी किताब दूर दूर तक पहुँच रही है. So for us, actually, what this book did was that it told us that writing and knowledge were not only the domain of the literate, that of the educated and privileged, and it wasn't, writing and knowledge were not also only individual. They could be a collective enterprise, they could be collectively created and collectively owned. So this book, as I said, traveled into the world. It taught us other lessons, another one being about the ownership of knowledge and the need to share it. While we as publishers had been taught to work with copyright, the owner's right to her work, what the Rajasthan women wanted was for the book to circulate. Unko paisa nahi banana tha. So it traveled, as I said, into several Indian languages, and they were very happy that it was circulating and so on. So the experience taught us to rethink issues of ownership. Some years later, we published another book called A Life Less Ordinary. आप लोगों ने शायद उसका नाम सुना होगा, by Baby Haldar, a domestic worker. और उस किताब की भी कुछ कहानी, बहुत बढ़िया सी कहानी थी, that she was a domestic worker in the house of a professor called Prabodh Kumar, जो कि IIT में पढ़ाते थे, retired थे वहाँ से, and he also happened to be the grandson of Premchand. And उन्होंने देखा कि ये लड़की जो मरी मरी उनके घर में आई थी, जो इतनी पिटती थी अपने घर में, शादी उसकी हुई थी 12 साल की उम्र पे, to a very violent man, and she had lived through dire poverty, and then she had left him and run away, and he employed her, and then he noticed that she was paying a lot of attention to books, and he then asked her and learnt that how she had been removed from school at the age of 12 to be married, and he then started to lend her books, and she taught her to read, and then she wrote this book and became a writer. So Baby's story alerted us to the existence of writing by women on the margins, poor low-caste women who had important things to say, but who did not sometimes have the words to say them or the access to have their works published. So before her book came out, a Dalit woman writer from Tamil Nadu, Bama, had broken many such shackles, and there are across India many examples of women in similar positions who have fought tremendous odds to be able to write, and what they've written and continue to write has often radically changed the world of writing. As often happens to women when they speak out, they're also accused for bringing the difficult and dirty realities of women's lives to public attention, because the subjects they talk about are often not fitting for the literary world. So for us, therefore, over time, it was these kind of stories that became more and more important. Okay, let me see how much time do we have, Simi?
All the time.
All the time. Bore to nahi ho rahe sare? Nahi, na? Theek hai. Okay, I'll take maybe 10-12 minutes more, then we can talk. Okay? So with each such book, we learned something. We understood well that the category woman needed at all times to be unpacked and nuanced, that the women who were most articulate and privileged, the sorts of authors we had begun with when we began to publish, were really a very small slice of the bigger picture. That in fact it was the others, the poor, the underprivileged, those who lacked literacy and education, others on the margins such as queer and trans writers, who formed the mass from whom we had to learn and who we wanted to address. So this meant first thinking of knowledge differently. No longer could we believe that knowledge is only that created by those in power. The stories we were publishing were these not stories that added to our knowledge of both caste, gender, poverty, power, politics, and personal lives. This also meant thinking of literature a bit differently, that changing the definition, and in doing so, I mean, these women, what they were writing, we called it literature, and in the writing, they were also democratizing it by putting it into the hands of many rather than letting it be the exclusive terrain of a select few. Often, because such works were collectively created, it also meant thinking of the creative process differently, and therefore also of the dissemination of what might call creative products. So were the standard retail outlets the only way to sell, or should we think of new possibilities of reaching work out? And the internet sometimes offered this space. There's no doubt that the internet is limited in its reach, but it also has a great deal of potential. So we discovered also that the act of writing for poor women was in many ways empowering, but in many ways it also set them apart in their societies, sometimes as women to be appreciated, and other times as women to be shunned and avoided. And many were then left alone and vulnerable, more than just producing. This for us meant rethinking the feminist publishing enterprise, because it became more than just producing the books. You also had to stand by the women whose lives you made vulnerable. So you also had to kind of play an activist role. And I'll give you the example of Bama, who is a well-known Dalit writer, who, when she wrote her first book, Karaku, it was a fictionalized account of her life. But she was really attacked in her own village for saying, why did you put this out? And the other attack she faced was from the church, because she also exposed the church. So in the act of writing really ended up making her more vulnerable. Since we began publishing, another area that has been really important to us, and we were talking about this earlier in Simi's room, how literature and translation has now become so much a part of so many courses. So translation was very important to us, not merely as a technical thing, but because we believe that many works that contribute to the feminist understanding of our lives exist in the Indian languages, and it is important for us to translate them into English and make them available to the English-speaking audience for their education. This is also important because works in the languages do not conform to the standards of acceptability laid down by English, and like the works of women from the margins, these works help us to expand and transform the literary sphere through the content they produce and the form in which they produce it. But for translation to work, it must happen both ways. For works from the Indian languages to go into English, and for works in English to go into the Indian languages. And this we are now doing. We are putting our work into the Indian languages, and I'll explain to you how. So there's a hierarchy of knowledge that places English above other languages, and the assumption then is that while English has more power, the Indian languages somehow have more authenticity. There are these two things at two ends that guide the whole world of translation. At the same time, because of the status of English, such material comes to acquire more legitimacy, somehow in what is called the mainstream, than it did in its own language sphere, despite the fact that the spread in its own language may be much more. So for us as publishers, the question of language was one we looked at in both ways. If material from Indian languages was to be translated into English, as I said, this must also work the other way. Also, much of the academic material generated by feminist studies tended to be in English, and we felt that it needed to go into Indian languages. Now here, we were very fortunate, but only for a limited period, because we found this literary foundation in Kolkata called the Prabha Khaitan Foundation, which is set up by the son of the writer Prabha Khaitan, who was a Hindi writer and who passed away. They do all kinds of literary things. So we had published Prabha Khaitan's autobiography in English, and her son said to us, is there anything else you would like to do? And I took him literally at his word and said, I have this dream, would you be willing to put money into it? And I can't imagine how I did it, because I hate asking people for money, but kabhi kabhi, thoda sa jigra ho jata hai. I said to him, ke theek hai, mujhe aap na thoda paisa de do to translate Zuban books into Indian languages. So he said, मैं आपको 3 साल की commitment दे देता हूँ, और मैं 3 साल हर साल आपको 8 लाख रुपए दूंगा. So we decided, okay, 8 लाख रुपए दे रहे हैं, तो 8 लाख में अगर हम 50,000 एक किताब के लिए देते हैं, हर साल में 16 किताबें हो जाएगी. 3 साल में हमारी 48 किताबें हो जाएंगी. अगर हम आगे नहीं बढ़ सकते, कोई बात नहीं, कम से कम 48 तो हो जाएंगी. We are just completing 3 years. We are at 47 books. We will commission 3 more before the year ends at end of March. And these are translated into 11 Indian languages. And it is amazing the kind of books, and what's amazing about it is that it has opened up for us a whole world of independent publishing in the Indian languages, which we never knew about. Because we are so focused on English sitting here in Delhi, we never knew कि हर जगह पे ये छोटे छोटे publisher हैं who are so politically committed कि वो मर मर के किताबें छाप रहे हैं. There's a woman doctor in Karnataka. She runs her practice and she uses all the money earned from there to publish books, and which she puts in the market at low prices or for free. Doesn't earn anything from it, but she does it out of commitment. So these kind of things. Okay, then I want to just move on to a couple of other things. So now by this time, let's say 30 years, 35 years, 30 years into the life of Kali, by the time Kali had closed and Zuban had formed, we knew very well that we were focusing on marginalized voices in the publishing. Now we asked ourselves other questions. That can you really call yourself feminist if you are publishing from the margins But if all the people who are controlling that knowledge belong to upper classes and upper castes, so we looked at the composition of our workplace and we said, where is the diversity there? क्या हमारे खुद के बीच diversity है? And you know, people can look at diversity in many ways. They can say, हम हिंदुस्तान के एक दिल्ली से आता है, एक बैंगलोर से आता है, एक हिमाचल से आता है, कहीं और से आता है, तो हम diverse हैं. लेकिन that is not the question. And we realized that we needed to work on that. And so we decided that, okay, this means that we will now start looking at every post that we advertise. We are a small office, but every post will be reserved. It will be reserved for queer, trans, non-binary, Dalit, Bahujan, minority religion. So अब हम mainstream का कोई post देते ही नहीं हैं. और and it also, so it has been so interesting and so exciting for us. It's difficult because you realize how much discrimination there is in our society and how people who come from marginalized identities do not have the opportunity to, for example, study design. So we were looking for a replacement for our design head and we reserved the post. And for months we could not find anyone. For months we could not find anyone because वो बेचारे किसी को वो education का मौका ही नहीं मिला है. So, you know, it opens your eyes to think, but what it also does, we are, by no means have we completed learning this, we are still experimenting and learning with it, but what it does is, turns what is essentially a Delhi-centric organization on its head. So, अब हमारे लोग जगह जगह से हैं, नॉर्थ ईस्ट से कोई है, हैदराबाद से कोई है, पुणे से कोई है, कर्नाटक से कोई है, तो गोवा से कोई है. So, हमारा सारा जो काम है ना, it acquires a different dimension just by virtue of the people being there. We also then asked ourselves the next question, which you inevitably will have to ask if you're looking seriously not only at content as an ideologically driven thing, but also your own practice, which is about, okay, we can look for people, diversity in this. How do we make our material accessible? How do we take it to people, for example, who have visual disability, who have hearing disabilities? Now, for all of that, you need money. We don't have money. We are completely broke all the time. We have a big name. I don't know how we get it, but we have no money. You know, we are poor as church mice. वो जो चूहे होते हैं वो churches में घूमते रहते हैं उसके लिए. So really, we just keep our heads above water every year. That's about how much we can manage to do. So ये कैसे करें? तो अब हम ये सोच रहे हैं, हमने अभी ये कि हम अपना सारा जो मटेरियल है उसको किसी ना किसी तरह किसी सज्जन को ढूंढेंगे जो हमें थोड़ा सा पैसा दे देंगे और उससे हम सारी किताबों को ऑडियो बुक्स बना के अपनी वेबसाइट पे फ्री डाल देंगे फॉर एनीबडी हु विशेस टू एक्सेस देम. सारी किताबों की ई बुक्स बना के वो भी फ्री में डाल देंगे और जहाँ तक हो सकता है ब्रेल की किताबें बना के उनको भी फ्री में डाल देंगे. Now this is a project that will take some time, but we've started thinking of it, and then the website also has to be accessible. So when you start thinking of these things, a lot of other doors kind of open up to you. I want to now conclude, so I just want to address a few points. I've spoken to you about our publishing, not in order to use this as an opportunity to promote my publishing house or my authors, लेकिन बाहर किताबें हैं, discount खरीद लीजिए जाके, है ना? But as a way of offering a perspective from the other side, so to speak, from the side of publishing and not that of writing. But how does publishing, the production and dissemination of knowledge, work to create the conditions in which writing can be received and read, and how do publishers ensure that they give space to a multitude of voices? What choices do we make and why? Most publishers will tell you they're not political and that they judge the books they publish purely on merit. I disagree with this radically and strongly, and I believe all choices are political. And in choosing what to publish and what to leave out, publishers are guided by many considerations that they often do not like to acknowledge. But I do think that for those of us who make overtly and explicitly political choices in what we publish, we need to be constantly alert to the ways in which we make choices and to be inclusive so that we are truly, the word I use is bibliodiverse. Bringing the voices of women into the world of writing and publishing, as we set out to do nearly 40 years ago, was our way of doing that. Along the way, we learned many lessons, and we continued to open up our publishing for it to become more diverse and more representative of our realities. In today's atmosphere, such political choices have become difficult and sometimes dangerous. The relationship between the writer and the reader is no longer merely one of expression and reception, but as you well know, even expression itself free expression on which should be a writer's right and responsibility is under threat. And the threat is not only one of opposition, which writers can deal with, but also of physical violence, of attack, often of death, sometimes of imprisonment, with the prospect of years spent with no hope of release or even a fair trial. In such a context, how do we as writers and publishers survive? जब आप इसको edit करेंगे ना ये निकाल देना. So, अभी तो चला जा रहा है. So I'm not going to pretend that I have an answer to this question. I don't. What I do know is that it's more than ever necessary for us to keep doing what we are doing to ensure that we write and our writing gets published. But yes, we are also human beings with lives and families, and those factors will influence the choices we make. I believe perhaps the way forward for us lies in embracing new ways of writing, new ways of dissemination alongside books. Does that mean going beyond the book? Perhaps it does. So 40 years ago, when we began the enterprise of feminist publishing, we were setting up an alternative to what we saw as the mainstream. Today, we are seeing how the mainstream itself is being redefined, how there's a different kind of power politics at play, which wishes to create a discourse in which different subversion, questioning, marginal voices have very little say. Perhaps the time has come for us to realize how much more complex the problem that we are faced with is. So when Mukta Salve exhorted the Brahmins, the Pandits, to listen to her 150 years ago, she was speaking for those denied access to knowledge and learning. If we are to carry the enterprise of feminist publishing into the future in its true spirit, we need to take Mukta Salve's challenge as a constant challenge and not allow ourselves to turn into mirror images of those in power who we have been engaged in countering. So I'm stopping there. Thank you so much for listening to me. Thank you. सब गर्मी में मर रहे हैं लेकिन आप लोग रुके रहे. Thank you. That's so nice of you. So अब मैं बैठ जाती हूँ. ठीक है.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. Before today, when I heard her, and before I'd heard her today, I'd always thought that Urvashi Butalia is a crusader. And this lecture today provides a glimpse into her crusading zeal and her commitment. And I really believe that meaningful writing comes from commitment with which she writes and does her work. Thank you, ma'am, for this insightful and enlightening lecture. And now I'd like to open the floor for a few questions from the audience.
I think we should not record the question answer so that there's a free discussion.